All right, welcome and good afternoon to our friends in the US and good evening to our friends in Europe and Africa. Thank you for joining us for the first webinar that Redeem International has ever done. My name is Jeff Atherstone. I'm the Chief Advancement Officer for Redeem International, and I'm here with our founder and CEO, Jesse Rudy. I'll be your host for the webinar, but you will not have to listen to me long, so don't worry. I've got a few household items to go over before we begin. First, you cannot see yourself, but I promise you, you are in the webinar and you are here with us. A few of the participants asked to remain anonymous. And so to ensure anonymity, we just made sure that everyone was off screen for the webinar, but we can see you. So thank you all for attending. I also want to let you know that we will be taking questions at the end. So please ask questions. Throughout the webinar, you can type in the chat. I'll be able to see your questions. I'll put them together and then I'll share them with Jesse at the end, and we'll get through as many as we can in the 45 minutes that we've asked you to join us on today. Now, for those of you who are new to Redeem, I'd love to introduce you to our founder and CEO, Jesse Rudy. Jesse began his career as a lawyer in Washington, D.C. Before founding Redeem in 2020, he had an extensive career in the justice field. He spent 12 years working at International Justice Mission. While he was there, he led teams in Sri Lanka, Uganda, and the Philippines, including their groundbreaking work to combat land grabbing from widows in Uganda. He also was a key member of their global leadership team, serving as the VP of strategy and briefly as the CFO. With that, I see that Jesse has loaded up his report and he's ready to go. So Jesse, take it over.
All right. Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, as Jeff said, my name is Jesse Rudy. I'm the founder and CEO of Redeem International. And we are excited to have everybody get together this afternoon to share the results of our most recent round of impact measurements. For the last 5 years, we have been saying that when it comes to protecting the homes and land of the world's most vulnerable widows and orphans, law enforcement leads to deterrence, deterrence leads to safety, and safety leads to prosperity. Basically, what we believe at Redeem is that if you restore enough land grabbing victims to their homes, and if you prosecute enough land grabbing perpetrators for their crimes, and then if you broadcast those results to the community, it will radically change criminal behavior, preventing tens of thousands of land grabbing abuses from ever occurring and providing a measurably safer community for hundreds of thousands of vulnerable women and children. But over the last 5 years, all we've really had to concretely show for that was 2,679 land grabbing victims who had been restored to their homes and 754 land grabbing perpetrators who are now facing prosecution. And while those are life-changing results for those individual women and children, we didn't really have the data to prove that our intervention teams could actually change criminal behavior on a wide scale until this summer. In August, we received the results of our independently overseen impact study, which measured victimization rate changes in our first 4 project areas among women who had been widowed up through calendar year 2023. And the data from that study clearly showed us that not only was our model working, but it was working even better than we hoped that it would. According to the data, that as of 2023, land grabbing victimization rates were already down 38% in Wakiso, 51% in Gulu, 75% in Mbale, and 86% in Iganga. And what that means is that across those first 4 teams, in just their first couple of years of intervention, over 30,000 land grabbing abuses had already been prevented. And over 1 million widows and orphans were already living in a measurably safer world. But before we dive into the details of the study and what the particular numbers are telling us, I know that there are some people here today that have been with us for a long time, and all of this is going to be repetitive, repetitive, repetitive. And I also know that there are some other people that are on the line today that might be completely new to Redeem's work and are just trying to figure it out. So I'm going to take a quick step back and give everybody a little bit of context around what it is we do at Redeem and why we choose to do it that way. So at Redeem, our mission is to protect the homes and land of the world's most vulnerable widows and orphans. We focus on land because for the hundreds of millions of widows and orphans that live across Africa, land is life. A family's land is their primary source of food, it's their primary source of income, it's their primary source of shelter, security, any kind of intergenerational wealth, and it's their standing in community. At the same time, a family's land is also a highly coveted asset. Land owned by a widow or an orphan routinely attracts the attention of land grabbers who use violence, fraud, and intimidation to drive these vulnerable families from the homes that they live in and the land that they depend on for survival. In the absence of intervention, over 50% of Africa's 34 million widows report losing everything after the death of their husband. One widow who lost everything was Fatima. Fatima was in her 50s when her husband passed away. She lived in the home that she and her husband had built together, and she relied on their 3 acres of land to support herself, her 3 daughters, and all of their children. After her husband died, his extended family started harassing Fatima. They told her that she'd failed the family because she'd only produced girl children. They told her that she was no longer welcome in their community and that she should go back to her own family because the land belonged to them. And then they just started taking over. They started planting crops on her land. They started threatening her every time that she would go into her garden, telling her that they were gonna hurt her children and hurt her grandchildren if she didn't give up everything that she and her husband had worked for to them. Now, Fatima went to the clan leaders and they confirmed that the land belonged to her both legally and culturally, but it didn't matter to her in-laws. Her sister-in-law claimed ownership and then sold off part of the land to an investor and then sold the rest of it to her nephew, who promptly went out and tore up all of Fatima's potatoes. And then when Fatima came back out to replant her potatoes, he beat her unconscious and he left her for dead while he threw her stuff out of her house and moved his stuff in. To protect widows like Fatima, Redeem deploys teams of local justice professionals to intervene on their behalf. These teams partner with local law enforcement authorities in individual land grabbing cases, restoring victims to their homes, prosecuting perpetrators for their crimes, and then broadcasting those results as a warning to anybody who would even think about stealing from a widow or an orphan. I got to meet Fatima in June of this year, and she was sitting out in front of her house. Our team had heard about her case from a local probation officer, and they quickly investigated Fatima's claim to the land and the assault by her nephew. They reached out to the investor, and he returned the portion of the land that he had purchased, and then they were able to obtain compensation for the damages caused by that sale. And then they worked with the clan leaders to plant concrete boundary stones in each corner of Fatima's property, demarcating the land that legally and culturally belonged to her. And then they secured the arrest and prosecution of Fatima's nephew for assault and criminal trespass. When I met Fatima, she showed me her house and she showed me the steel door and the burglar bars that she had put in on the windows with using the compensation money that our team had recovered. She showed me the little roadside business that our social workers had helped her set up to earn extra money to be more secure in her home. And then she walked me through all of her new planted fields. There was maize, there was potatoes, there was cassava. She even planted a little bit of coffee. And then she walked around and she touched every one of those concrete boundary markers that told the world that the land belonged to her. And then we came back to her house, and then she just she just started dancing while my family and I were basically crying. What you can't see in this picture is that Fatima's hips are going all over the place as she's trying to teach me how to dance with her, and my hips are not. I failed miserably at the dance lesson. Uh, we intervene in individual cases like Fatima's because there is nothing in the world that is better than dancing with a widow outside of her home when she's gotten her land back. We also do it because we believe that law enforcement leads to deterrence, deterrence leads to safety, and safety leads to prosperity. At the end of the day, land grabbing is motivated by greed. People don't steal land because there's some sort of monster that's compelled to prey on innocent women and children. And they don't do it because they're idiots who don't actually realize that what they're doing is wrong. They do it because it is highly profitable and there is almost zero risk of accountability. It's an economic decision for them. And when the laws are not being enforced, the rewards for stealing land are much, much greater than the risks of being punished. At Redeem, we want to see widows and orphans prosper. And if you want to see a widow or an orphan prosper, they have to be safe on their land. And if you want them to be safe on their land, you have to deter the criminals that would steal that land from them. And by far, it's not even comparable, by far, the best way to deter land grabbers is to simply enforce the law. Every time you put a family who has had their land stolen from them back on their land, what you're telling the community is that stealing land is no longer as profitable as they once thought it was. And every time a land grabber gets hauled off in handcuffs is arrested and prosecuted, you're telling them that stealing land is actually a high-risk endeavor. And eventually, these law enforcement actions can and will tip the scale of the risk-reward balance for these would-be perpetrators, deterring land grabbers from stealing land, creating blankets of safety for women and children across the community, and unleashing their power to prosper. Our intervention model was designed to test this theory of change. We set out to deploy 10 intervention teams to strategic locations across Uganda. Each team was made up of 12 local justice professionals, investigators, attorneys, social workers, community relations specialists, security, and those people were deployed for 6 years each to a very specific geographic footprint. And over the course of their 6-year deployment, they were going to be working to restore over 900 individual land grabbing victims to their homes and to secure the arrest and prosecution of over 125 land grabbers for their crimes. And the collective goal for these law enforcement actions is to change the risk reward calculation for would-be land grabbers in the community, reducing land grabbing victimization rates by 50 to 80% among a vulnerable population of roughly 250,000 vulnerable women and children, effectively preventing over 40,000 land grabbing abuses from ever occurring. We launched our first team in Gulu in October of 2020, in the height of the pandemic. A year later, we launched our second team in Wakiso. Then we launched a team in Aganga, then in Mbale, in Lira, in Arua, in Soroti, in Hoima, in Mubende. And then in June of this year, we launched our 10th team in Tororo, meeting our goal and reaching kind of our saturation point of 10 teams in strategic locations across Uganda. And so far, these teams have done a really good job of implementing our solution in their respective project areas. As you might guess, our two leading indicators of a team's success are the number of land grabbing prosecutions they secure and the number of land grabbing victims that they restore to their homes. And what you can see from these two charts is that our teams have, by and large, met or exceeded expectations in these two key metrics. As of the end of last quarter, the teams have collectively secured the arrest and prosecution of 754 land grabbers for their crimes. And they have collectively restored 2,679 land grabbing victims to their homes and land. And while our teams were busy restoring victims to their homes and prosecuting land grabbers for their crimes and broadcasting those results, we also had a team that was busy surveying widows to measure the impact that the work was having on land grabbing victimization rates in each of our project areas. To do that, we retained independent experts to help us design and conduct a series of annual impact studies. We partnered with monitoring, evaluation, and research consultant Andy Cooper Parks to oversee the impact studies design and its implementation. And then we partnered with advanced statistician Dr. Kyle Vincent to oversee quality control and data analysis for each of the studies. Now, it turns out that measuring victimization rates is actually really, really hard to do. It's hard because crime is inherently hard to measure. It's also hard because victimization rate change is actually a long lagging indicator, which means that you have to let time pass after you implement your solution to measure whether it's actually changed anything. And it's also hard because the population of widows and orphans in a given area is constantly shifting. Every year, there are new widows entering the vulnerable population as their husbands pass away. And every year, there are widows and orphans who are in the vulnerable population who are being victimized. And then every year, there are widows, both victimized and unvictimized, who are exiting the population as they pass away or move away from the area. So, to accurately measure change in victimization rates over time, what you need to do is you need to let time pass, and then you need to collect annualized samples of the vulnerable population that are randomly selected, completely independent of one another, and yet similar enough to be comparable year over year over year. And to do that, we had to develop a methodology that used newly widowed women as a proxy for the vulnerable population. What that looks like is that each year, the team would identify a randomly selected sample of women in our project area who had been widowed 2 years earlier. So when we took our first measurements in 2023, we were actually sampling women who had been widowed in 2021. And when we took our measurements this year in 2025, we were actually sampling women who had been widowed in 2023. We would sample those women, we would survey them, and ask them questions about the first 12 months of their widowhood to determine what percentage of the women who had been widowed in that year had been land grabbing victims during the first year catchment period that we were studying for that particular year. And then the teams could repeat that process year after year after year, creating annual samples that were randomly selected, completely independent from each other, and perfectly comparable. And comparing those samples for women widowed in the baseline year, then comparing that to year 1 and to year 2, and then on down the road, allowed us to see changes in victimization rates over time in each one of our project areas. As I mentioned before, we took our first measurements in 2023, and so we had our first comparison data last summer in 2024. And when we got the results back last summer, the truth is that the changes in victimization rates were actually so much greater than what we expected that we decided not to publish them. Now, Jeff will tell you this, he was not very happy with me about this because I was keeping good news a secret, but we wanted to be absolutely sure that there wasn't some sort of flaw in our methodology or some noise in the data or some external factor that was making it look like victimization rates in our project areas were dropping far faster and farther than we originally thought they could. But then in August of this year, we got the results from the measurements of women who had been widowed in 2023. And those results confirmed everything that we'd saw in last year's data. In fact, the results were even better than they had been the year before. The measurements from Gulu, Wakiso, Iganga, and Mbale, which were the only 4 teams that we had active operations in 2023, those results showed that land grabbing victimization rates had already dropped by an average of 34% in the first year of implementation, by an average of 37% in the second year of implementation, and by an average of 51% in the third year of implementation. And what's even better than that is that the results were consistent. We saw massive drops in victimization rates in all 4 of our measured project areas. Gulu was the first team that we opened, and we launched that team in October of 2020, and rates in Gulu by the end of 2023 were already down 51%. In Wakiso, which we launched a year later in October of 2021, rates were down 38%. And Iganga, which we had launched in April of 2022, rates were down a crazy 86%. And in Wakiso, our most recent opening at that point, which we had launched in October of 2022, rates were already down 75% in their very first calendar year of operations. Collectively, what that means, these drops in victimization rates meant that over 1 million widows and orphans were now living in a measurably safer environment. And over $30 million worth of land that would have otherwise been lost to land grabbers was safe and secure in the hands of its rightful owners. But at the end of the day for Redeem, what we say is our ultimate indicator of success is the number of land grabbing abuses that our teams prevent from ever happening in the first place. And based on these victimization rate measurements, the demographics in our project areas, and what we know about the contours of land grabbing crimes, we are proud to say that as of the end of 2023, our teams had already prevented the abuse of over 30,000 widows and orphans. That is 30,000 women and children who would have fallen victim to land grabbers in 2022 and 2023 in the absence of our intervention, but avoided that devastation because of the deterrent impact created by our team's work in their communities. To put 30,000 people into perspective, 30,000 people is 1.5 times the maximum capacity of Madison Square Garden. So if you asked every single widow and orphan who avoided land grabbing victimization as a result of our work to squeeze themselves into Madison Square Garden, you would fill every single seat in the house, and there would still be 10,000 more women and children waiting to get inside. And the cost of their ticket would be a fraction of what it costs to go to a Knicks game. There are really kind of 2 schools of thought when it comes to calculating cost per beneficiary. There are some people who want to see the full freight cost per beneficiary for each calendar year. That is, they want to know how much did the organization spend in total in a given year for their programming, for fundraising, for overhead, for everything. And then they want to divide that number by the number of beneficiaries who benefited that particular year. In this case, the number of people who avoided victimization in that calendar year. On the other hand, there are some people who want to understand the direct cost of beneficiary over the life of a program. And for this, what they want to know is how much has the organization spent on a particular project or a particular program, regardless of the year. And then they want to divide that number by the number of of people that have benefited. Again, the number of abuses that have prevented in our case, regardless of what year that took place. So here's a quick look at cost per abuse prevented through both of these lenses. First, for the full freight cost per beneficiary. In 2022, our global team spent just over $1.5 million in total. That's program money, that's fundraising money, that's overhead, that's the cost of this Zoom call, that's the cost of coffee that we drank, everything that we spent money on. And they either restored land to or prevented the victimization of just over 9,000 women and children, which works out to a full freight cost of about $169 per beneficiary. And in 2023, as we started to gain momentum, we got even more efficient. In 2023, we spent just over $2.7 million globally over the course of that year and either restored land to or prevented the victimization of nearly 22,000 women and children, which works out to a full freight cost of only $126 per beneficiary. Now, to look at direct cost per beneficiary, let's zoom in on the team in Uganda. We launched the Uganda team in April of 2022. And between April of 2022 and December of 2023, we had invested a grand total of $460,771 in that team, in their salaries, and in their work. And during that time, the team had restored 49 victims like Fatima to their homes, and secured the arrest and prosecution of 33 violent criminals like Fatima's nephew. Now, that's not a great cost per victim restored or cost per victim rescued or criminal prosecuted, excuse me. It just isn't. But the impact of Fatima being restored to her land and her nephew being held accountable for his crimes went far beyond Fatima and her grandkids and her kids. In 2022, the Uganda's first year of operations, the deterrent impact of cases like Fatima's had already driven land grabbing victimization rates down by 29%, preventing roughly 1,600 land grabbing abuses from occurring. And in 2023, the second year of operations, it really started picking up momentum. Land grabbing victimization rates were down 86%, preventing an additional 4,700 land grabbing abuses from occurring. So over the course of those 2 years, over 6,300 widows and orphans who otherwise would have fallen victims to land grabbers were safe, secure, and undisturbed in their land ownership, all at a cost of roughly $73 per abuse prevented. Now, just in case you're thinking that I was cherry picking and I picked the team that had the best score, I just want you to know the average score across all 4 teams, the average cost per abuse prevented across all 4 teams was $74. And in addition to that, now what you got to understand is that the individual victims or widows who would have been victimized, they're not the only ones to benefit from the deterrent impact of our work. The security of living in a measurably safer environment is actually a massive benefit to all of the widows and orphans in the vulnerable population. I mean, USAID found that land without a risk of eviction is 63% more productive than land where there is a risk of eviction. And Landesa reports that women, particularly women, with strong property and inheritance rights protections earn up to 3.8 times more income than women who don't. And so looking at this through the lens of people protected, we estimate that as of 2023, there were roughly 225,000 widows and orphans living in the Uganda project area. And because of the deterrent impact of the Uganda team's work, each of those women and children are living on land that is 86% safer than it was just 2 years ago, all at a cost of over just $2 per person protected. Now, to me, that is an incredible return on investment. Obviously, we are very excited about what we're seeing in our impact study data. I mean, victimization rate drops of 38 to 86% in 3 years or less is honestly much, much more than we could have asked or imagined. And 30,000 land grabbing abuses prevented before we really even start to hit the meat of our implementation is just more than exciting for us. And so, as we look toward the immediate future, these results have us focused on three big things. The first one is pressing the advantage in our first 10 Uganda project areas. There are currently 2.7 million widows and orphans living in those 10 project areas. And we seem to have found a way to effectively and efficiently make their lives much, much better. We have the staff that's in place, we have momentum on our side. And so, first and foremost, we want to continue administering the medicine, driving victimization rates down as fast and as far as we can in each one of those project areas, preventing hundreds of thousands of land grabbing abuses from occurring, and providing real protection for millions of otherwise vulnerable women and children. The second thing we're focused on is continuing to optimize our intervention model. I would say we gave ourselves about a solid 10 minutes to celebrate the results before we started asking questions about what this means for our intervention model. I mean, it looks like we may be able to shorten our team's deployments from 6 years to 4. Or maybe we could leverage the results to accelerate our plan to scale through government ownership of our solution. Or, all of this could potentially drive our cost per abuse prevented down from $73 to maybe $50 or even $25. And so the team right now is actively at work fleshing out alternative ways for us to more efficiently administer the medicine now that we know it takes far fewer doses than we originally thought to achieve the result. And the third thing we are focused on right now is expanding the field. Land grabbing is not just a Ugandan problem. There are 34 million widows living in sub-Saharan Africa today, caring for hundreds of millions of fatherless children. And the best research out there says that over half of them lose everything when they lose their husbands. And we have somehow stumbled on a way to change that reality. And I believe because we have stumbled onto that solution, we have a responsibility to produce it as quickly and as big as we possibly can. And that's why just 3 weeks ago, I was in Lusaka, Zambia, launching a pilot project to determine the extent to which our Ugandan intervention model can be adapted to the Zambian context. We now have a project director in place. We have a registration certificate from the NGO Bureau. We have a partnership with the Zambia Land Alliance. And we have the enthusiastic support of both the Zambian Police Service and the National Prosecution Authority. And we are excited to see what this pilot has to teach us about working in Zambia specifically and about multinational expansion more generally. Before we jump into questions, I just wanted to say thank you to those of you who have been investing in our work over the last few years. Your investment has made all of this possible. And you are literally changing the lives of tens of thousands of widows and orphans and providing protection to over 1 million vulnerable women and children. And to those of you who have not yet had the opportunity to partner with us, I want to say thank you for giving us some of your time. I would love to give you a deeper dive into our model and the impact that we're seeing it have. Ask questions here, but also let's schedule a 30-minute call over the next few weeks to talk about our work and what a partnership could look like. You can drop a note into the chat. You can send me an email. You can send Jeff an email, and we'll get something set up on the calendar with you. And really to everybody who took the time to join us today, I know you've got better things to do at 4 o'clock on a Monday afternoon, and then we know that your time is incredibly valuable. We don't take these minutes for granted. we are grateful that you would share a little bit of your time with us. Um, so now we've got about 10 minutes left. I'd be happy to take anybody's questions over the next few minutes. I think you've been dropping them in the chat. Jeff will pass them on to me, and we'll do our best to answer what we can. Thank you again for your time. Really appreciate it.
All right. Thanks, Jesse. I'll give you one moment to catch your breath. That was amazing.
Woo! There's a lot of words.
I've heard you do it so many times, but it's still so encouraging every time. And so thanks for sharing with everyone today. I do want to let everyone know that you will receive a copy of this webinar. We'll email it out to you. We'll also send you a brief slide deck just so you could have these numbers. For those of you who are trying to catch everything, we'll have that sent out to you in an email this week. Um, with that, a few questions have come in. First one for you, Jesse, is in your data study, do you have a control group that you're testing against?
Okay. That is a really, really good question. Typically, when I talk to people about our data and they are data interested people, first thing they ask is, "Did you do an RCT? Do you have a control group?" And I don't know if you guys know this about me, but I'm a former litigator, and what we used to have to do is we used to have to build these uh, witness binders, and we had to figure out what people were which way everything was going to go. And so I actually made a slide that would answer this question because I knew it probably would come up. But the reality is, let me pull that slide up here. Um, the reality is, we didn't believe that there was an ethical way that we could conduct a true randomized control trial. Um, Here we go. Because at the end of the day, our solution is engaging local law enforcement. And so the only way that we could really do a control group, a randomized control trial, would be to identify victims in the control group, which are women and children who are actively being abused by violent criminals, and then to not report it to authorities, and not even to tell them how to report it to authorities or even recommend to them to report it to authorities. Because anytime we encourage them to engage local law enforcement, essentially what we would be doing is we'd be ruining the control. And that just is something that we can't do. We cannot go interview women and children who are being abused and not step in and intervene on their behalf. But that doesn't mean that we don't have a counterfactual against which to compare our results. Um, as I mentioned earlier, we staggered the start of our teams, which you can see in this chart. And we also took multiple measurements before we got started. So we didn't just take a baseline measurement, we also measured in the preceding year. And because we stagger the start of our projects and because we take multiple measurements prior to the engagement of our engagement, what we're able to do is we're able to conduct what people a lot smarter than me call a staggered difference in differences quasi-experimental analysis. I'll say that again because it's a whole lot of syllables. A staggered difference in differences quasi-experimental analysis, which is an accepted way to substitute for a randomized controlled trial to assess causation. And when we perform that analysis, what we find is that the difference in differences is actually really, really wide. The average year over year change in measurements that were taken pre-intervention, so in the years prior to our intervention, the average year over year change was actually plus 12%. In other words, in the years prior to our intervention, victimization rates in those areas was actually moving up by 12%. And the average year over year change in measurements taken during the period of our intervention was down 27%. So what that means is that you see an average of a 39-point improvement in places that we're operating when compared to places where we're not operating. And so we feel very confident that we are doing what we can to have a control group, even though we can't ethically do a true randomized control trial.
Okay, the questions are flying in here. Next one.
All right.
This is more of a broader sector question. What other global NGOs are working towards the same outcomes in the areas where we're serving? And what's the level of coordination or collaboration with other organizations in this field that we're working with?
Yeah. Um, I would say we're a little bit of a unicorn or a hybrid between a lot of different organizations. There are many organizations that are working in the justice space. International Justice Mission comes to mind. Obviously, we have a great relationship with them, and they do amazing work. But they do work in a wide variety of crime types, not including land grabbing from widows and orphans. Other organizations that do really good work in the justice space, Human Trafficking Institute, Love Justice. There's a whole number of them that work very well in the justice space, but very few that focus on protecting the homes and land of vulnerable widows and orphans. On the other end, there are in Uganda and in Zambia a number of what I would call legal aid service providers. And legal aid service providers, their job is to find people that don't have access to justice because of their circumstances or their poverty, and to provide them access to justice. And a lot of those legal aid service providers engage in land grabbing cases, but their objective tends to be, how can I give these people access to the courts? How can I reach a brokered settlement? Uh, we are the only organization that I know of that is actively working in the justice sector to protect the homes and land of vulnerable widows and orphans, and focused on creating a deterrent impact. In other words, restoring victims to their homes, much like legal aid service providers do, but also holding land grabbing perpetrators accountable for their crimes, so that we change the risk reward calculation for would be abusers and actually prevent victimization from happening before it occurs.
All right, we're going to go from broad to very narrow. We're going to ask a Jesse Rudy question. How did you develop an interest in this particular area?
I had no idea, like most people in the United States, I had no idea this was something that actually existed. Um, I, when I was a young attorney, um, I'd heard of this organization called International Justice Mission, and was supporting them financially, and a job came open, and I threw my hat in the ring for that position, and I got a job offer, and the job offer went something like this: we'd like to send you to become a field office director in one of our offices. Uh, we can't tell you where it is. Um, and I thought that seemed a little weird, but I said I said yes, thinking that IJM was going to send me to Southeast Asia to work on a program to combat sex trafficking of children, because that was largely what I knew about IJM. And then a couple of months later, they said, "Hey, we're going to send you to Uganda to combat a crime that we refer to as succession-related property grabbing." And I will tell you, my initial thought was, I have no idea what that is. And my second thought was, it sounds horribly, horribly boring. Like it sounds like an accounting issue or something. And so I was a little disappointed, but I'd signed up. And so I got on a plane and moved my family to Uganda. And on my very first day, uh, the team brought me out and they sat me down in this little tent that was our conference room. And they put this stack of case files in front of me, and they said, "We're going to go through every case." And they just started walking me through story after story after story of these women and children that were having the most horrible things done to them that one human being can do to another. There were wells that had been poisoned. There were livestock that had been slaughtered. There were crops burned to the ground. There were houses that had been burned to the ground. Women and children that had been hacked to death with machetes. And what I figured out that day and over the course of the next 5 years is that, like, there's a lot of horrible things that people do to each other. And there's a lot of ways that people exploit the vulnerable. But I have never found anyone on the entire planet that is absolutely as alone as a woman in rural Uganda when her husband's family, the family that is supposed to be protecting and providing for her, that is supposed to make sure that other people don't attack her, turn on her like a pack of wolves and decide to just consume her. And so, after doing the work there at IJM for years, we decided, Gary Haugen and I, the founder at IJM, and I decided that we would spin this out into a standalone organization where I could wake up every single day trying to figure out how to protect widows and orphans from this.
Thanks, Jesse. We've reached time, but I'm going to squeeze in one more question. Everyone else who's been submitting questions, I've written them down. We will send you answers, but I want to respect everyone's time. Last one, Jesse, is what are your plans for expansion, and how can we partner in that work?
Um, yeah, it's a it's a great question. So, like I said before, we're focused on three big things. One is pressing the advantage in our existent casework areas. Two is continuing to optimize the model and continuing to just blow out the results in Uganda as efficiently and effectively as possible. And three is we are looking towards multi-country expansion in the future. And the first step in that is to our first step in that is this pilot project in Zambia. And so over the course of the next 12 months, we're going to be running test balloon litigation in Zambia. And assuming that that is successful, we will then start deploying casework teams across Zambia, much like we did in Uganda, as we begin doing field assessments in other countries down the road. Right now, let me, I actually was prepared with a slide for this as well. Give me just a second. Um, right now, our Right now, our expense budget for our next fiscal year is about $5.6 million. Of that, we are projecting funding from our current partners. So if you're a current partner, please continue to give next year. We are projecting giving and growth from our current partners of about 3.6 of that $5.6 million, which means we need to find new funding of about $2 million to fill just the base budget. And then in addition to that, there are kind of four big projects that I would really like to invest in if we had the additional resources to do that. One is we'd like to spend some extra money on upgraded data analysis, new data systems, bringing on a staff member that can help serve in kind of a data science role. Two is accelerated fundraising so that we can continue to grow this machine, continue to be in more places because we have more resources. Three is we would love to conduct a nationwide baseline study in Zambia, which we think is going to cost about $350,000 to do. And four is we would love to conduct a backward-looking nationwide study in Uganda. You asked the question about the randomized controlled trials and controls. One way we could bolster that is doing a completely independently conducted nationwide study in Uganda to see what we're doing in our areas and what's going on in other areas where we can intervene after the fact. So that those are our big needs financially as we look into the next year.
All right, great. Well, I want to say thank you to everyone for joining us today. I really appreciate all of you making the time. Jesse, any final word as you send us out today?
Um, Again, I just want to say thank you. Um, our tagline at Redeem is that she is strong. Together we make her safe. Women like Fatima, they're not weak. Uh, she is an incredibly strong and resilient woman, as are the tens of thousands of women that she represents. Um, and they are strong, but it's only together that we can make them safe. So I just really appreciate you all taking the time to learn about what we do and looking forward to having conversations with you about it in the future.
Thank you all for attending. We'll be sending you the impact report and the recording of the webinar. Have a wonderful evening wherever you are.